Welcome to part 3 of my character design process series. Today we'll be going through rendering process, all the magicalness of how I make a character look freaking fantastic, as well as watching me make decisions, because decisions are hard and I have to decide on this final design and it's a lot of work and there's so many options, but here we are. So quick recap if you haven't watched part 1 or part 2, which you probably should.
Do it.
But if you aren't, here's a quick recap. In part 1, I made lots of thumbnails and then these 2 crappy sketches, which I then took to part 2 to make iterations off of a lot of iterations. And now here we are, part 3, where we're making decisions and trying to figure out what this final character design is going to look like. Welcome aboard. Okay, so I needed to make one last iteration, but this time is for all of the chips. It's the final design. And all these past iterations were just kind of basic, and I wanted to give her a unique look to make her appear rough and tough and like she has actually been on adventures and not like some shiny new Barbie out of the packaging. So I gave her some exposed stitching and some fangs to be like her trophies of her adventuring, as well as some stripped fabric. Oh, and I decided to give her some face and body paint to emphasize her warriorness. After I decided on this version of the design, it is now time for me to ink it. Yeah, so this part is boring, so here's the final outline. And now I have to figure out the toughest part of this design, the armor. So I actually had to chop up the sword and move the pieces around like a puzzle in order to be able to make the pieces fit together, because I wanted the sword to actually come apart and fit together as armor, like a transformer, except less car and more unicorn. So this part took a while, and I also had to draw the back of her design just to make sure that the sword parts would actually work. Under normal circumstances, I would not even be drawing the back of the design until I do the model sheet, which is in part 4. But this sword is no normal design circumstance. So here's some premature booty drawings. Enjoy. After the design is official, it's time to pick the colors. So I didn't really record myself picking the colors because it's kind of boring and it's just me fiddling around with hue adjustments. But here are some different colors that I tried out, and I ended up falling on this blue-purple color scheme because it looks cool and I thought it was perfect for the kind of vibe I want to give my character. And now we get into my secret sauce of how I make this character design sparkle. My rendering process. I discovered that this has been the fastest method to rendering a character design while also making sure it's high quality enough. And it's also great because 3D artists can understand the textures and the form, and it's flashy enough to be like a character illustration. Using my somewhat clean line art of the character design, I make a layer below the line art, fill it in with gray, and then decrease the opacity of the line art layer. With a new layer on top of everything, I take this soft brush and with black, I start adding shading. While adding the shading, my goal is to make this character look like a 3D model. I discovered that if you shade in using basic ambient occlusion, which ambient occlusion in normal person terms is the shading of a subject when there is no direct light on it. So if I just do this basic shading of the ambient occlusion, or in this case, the shading of a 3D model, it makes it faster and easier for me to render. And later on, I can add additional light sources so that I can have more of that pop kind of feel. This method of just rendering the ambient occlusion for the shading makes my life so much easier. Work smarter, not harder. The less you think, the faster you can create. Okay? After I'm happy with the shading, I take the colors that I picked out and overlay them on top of the shaded figure. Now this is a little bit too bright for me, so I paint the black on top and lower the opacity till I think it's close enough to the original colors that I had picked. At this point, I am not quite done with it yet. I know it looks great because I just slapped color on top, but we are not done. This is where I make my character come to life and add that spark of magicalness that she so deserves and needs. So my first order of business is adding some red tint to her skin, give her some life, some jubilance, some red blood cells in her face and other areas. And I just lightly paint on top. I don't want to go too hard because with this bright red it would be too red and we don't want that. And I paint in the shadows so it gets some nice saturation, because typically when you're doing inside lighting, like in this case, the shadows are saturated while the highlights are desaturated, and then it would be vice versa for the sunlight, but that doesn't matter right now. So in this case, I'm trying to add more pop to the shadows, as well as adding some bounce light from the blue in the sword to her articles of clothing. And finally, I add some gold shinies because textures are important. Now with all the layer adjustments done, I paint on top of everything, adding extra details so that this character can really come to life. The last thing I need to figure out for this character is a name. So if any of y'all have any suggestions, comment down below. So this is the final design and I am so happy with how she turned out. Like, look at her, that magical awesomeness. She would put any other humanoid unicorn character to shame. That is it for this video. Like and subscribe for part 4, where I'll be showing y'all how I make a model sheet. Don't forget to suggest a name for her down below in the comments. I will see y'all in part 4. Deuces.